Hello and welcome to GMT's at any cost Metz 1870 after action chat. This is the first time I've done a video replay, and I thought I'd add in my thoughts after the whole game to see what I thought of the system. Hopefully it'll be useful in some people's playing decisions. And I'll go through my likes, my dislikes, some general observations, some strategy tips that I thought might be useful. So, without further ado, I'll go through my likes for this game. So it's an unusual game in that it is actually able to model controlled chaos, but without the need of cards. So I know it does use chits, but the chits are there are a certain amount of them, but it certainly doesn't have the range that a card-based event system would have. But it does manage the control chaos really quite well. Yeah, I haven't actually seen that in another system before, and I have been doing this for quite a few years. I mean, great kudos for that organisation there. Particularly the two grand chits, if you like, which will be the Prussian aggressive tactics and also Bazain's malaise. They seem to be far more powerful than all the others, really. And I did put them in as the planned chit every single turn of the game, and it seemed the right thing to do. I didn't think at any time during the game that I wouldn't want to put either of those chits in. For the aggressive tactics, that was a gateway to victory hexes for the French on the cheap, certainly. And the Bazain's malaise did actually delay the French army very significantly, actually. Probably was the main contributor to the fact that the 4th French Corps never even got into the game, or the vast majority of it, certainly. So the second thing I did like was the army differentiation, so that the armies play completely differently. It really is quite significant. There's a stark contrast between them, where you have the Prussians with very stout infantry who are very good at the assault combat, and the artillery, which is very good at the fire combat. And also the fact that the HQs, when their posture changes, their aggressive posture is actually a higher command radius than defensive. And then there's almost the opposite, really, with the French, in that the fire combat of the infantry, and the much better at it than the artillery, and the fact that you have the mitrailleurs as well. That's their sort of speciality, and I think on assault combat they're kind of average, I suppose. They're not as good as the Prussians, but yeah, that difference is actually quite stark when playing the game. And again, the HQs, the posture is that the defensive has a higher command radius than the aggressive. It's the opposite, and that's again quite significant. I would also say that once the French army units get battle worn, then they are exceedingly fragile, which is not quite the case with the Prussians, although the Prussians tend to have less infantry units. But I like that differentiation. I think even though they don't look that different, they do play very, very differently. One significant difference, I think, is also the movement factor. I think that the 4 average for the Prussians and the 3 average for the French, with the exception of the Imperial Guard, means that with the French, if you're moving in anything other than flat terrain, then you're gonna be moving 1 hex, and that's it. Whereas the Prussians have a little bit more leeway. Certainly, in forest for 2 and upslope, etc. They can still keep going, and that 4 to 3 difference is actually a lot more significant than it looks. So I like the decision making in the game. So there's the planning chit, which I didn't really do in this game because I because of the solo factor, and I think the 2 chits I mentioned before are the most important ones, and I would have more often than not put them in. Yeah, I mean, there is a point to be said of whether the chits on the track to prevent those 2. If you didn't pick the chit, then it's you're fooling the other person into putting chits on the track that they don't need to, because they don't know if that chit's there or not. But certainly on the solo side, it was I put it in anyway. But that planning, I suppose, is a decision which I didn't have to make, but I think is quite interesting to make at the beginning of each turn. What the posture should be on the HQ is a good is a good decision area that's really quite critical during turns and needs some thought. I think that the flip side, really, I know that it mentions a lot in the rules about the road movement bonus, but I think the significant thing, really, is the rallying. So if you're an aggressive, you can go next to, engage into a hex next to another, an enemy piece, but you can't rally. And in defensive, it's the opposite. And I think those 2 are... I know I pondered quite a bit on some of the postures because of those 2 decisions, and I knew I couldn't do both together. So is that. Whether you play an event or whether you put it on a track, again, is a big decision. And also whether you hold the chit or use it immediately. Great temptation to use it immediately. I think in almost all cases I did. And I usually only held it because it was not necessarily that useful at the time and couldn't be put on the track. But I think I was possibly a little bit too hasty in that decision sometimes. But that's another decision again. So never mind about which hex is occupied by which piece, your frontage, who's going to fire, who's going to be retreated, that kind of thing, which is a normal war game kind of decision. This has these other decisions in there, which is a lot more brain power than even, say, a card play is. Which card to pick. There's probably several options, but you're going to pick one of them, and that's one decision. Whereas this is layered yes/no decisions, or one alternative and the other. But they're not difficult decisions. They're not difficult in that they're complex, and it's fairly obvious what the 2 options will give you in the game when you're at those decisions. Finally, I really did like the cavalry model here. So having played a lot of Napoleonic games, La Bataille series, some American Civil War games, which have certainly Napoleonics has a lot of cavalry in it. Maybe down to the Great Battles of History series. That cavalry is either modelled too aggressively different than infantry, and so they're quite complex to learn the rules and remember the rules for them for the amount of use they get, or they look just like fast infantry. And this is a really nice middle ground on that is that they're really not infantry, but they're not complex in their use, so that the rules are fairly straightforward, but they're not the same as infantry, and you shouldn't use them as infantry, and you'll get your comeuppance if you try and use them as infantry, and also that they were useful on the flanks, whereas in a lot of games you stick your cavalry on the flanks because that's where you stick them, and they're no use elsewhere on the battlefield. So they're kind of an afterthought as that, but actually the flank capability of the cavalry is good in this game. And the differentiation between the light, medium, heavy is very simple, very straightforward, but and works very well. And models the cavalry differences in a very simple way. It's quite a thoughtful way of doing it, and quite elegantly simple way of doing it. So that's my likes of the game, and I do, on balance, really like the game. Okay, so on to my dislikes. So there's been a lot of chat online I've seen about this game, about the combat results table. And yeah, it is quite wild and woolly, particularly on the assault combat. You can have a decent column in an attack assault and still come out, the other end in a fairly sorry state, with, an unlucky roll, but not a rare roll. And there's the idea of a 2d10 or 2d6 instead, as a difference to the 1d10. However, the chaos of the game kind of lends itself to the fact that the combat is a little bit chaotic as well. And so I think the flavour is okay. However, you're going to have to live with the results of it. So if you like your chaos, certainly keep the 1d10. If you want a bit more determinism in your combat, then fine. I think both will work, and so I'm just a little sold on the charm of the 1d10, that it seems to match the other chaos of the controlled chaos of the game, and surprising results happening more often than possibly they should. It's not like this isn't a surprising battle, and it might not work so much for the Gravelotte scenario or for the campaign game, but certainly Mars Latour is a very strange battle, and these strange results coming up a little bit more often is kind of in keeping, I think, with what's going on here. So the other thing is reinforcements. So certainly for this scenario, I can't really say for the other scenarios, but certainly for this scenario, particularly on the French side, they're almost pointless. The idea that they get a turn in command coming on the board, which puts them slightly closer to where they should be, or where they need to try and get to, but that's all. It isn't really enough, I feel. It's either a case of it shouldn't have bothered putting them in the scenario, really, and the French should almost ignore them and possibly not even bother bringing them on the board, or some provision for French reinforcements should be made. The Prussians don't suffer this. They've got two advantages here. One is that they're very near their board edge for all of the game, so a reinforcement coming on will usually only be a turn away from its HQ, but also the fact that you can actually bring those reinforcements on early by these force marching on the Prussian reinforcements track. So the upshot is the Prussians can get to the battlefield a lot quicker than the French can, even though they're on the board. So yeah, I'm not very sold on the way reinforcements are done. It kind of leads me on to my third dislike actually. Although the combat chart is not really a dislike, it's a sort of it's a troubling aspect maybe, which I'm not sure about. But the next one is the lull in battle done by the Fortunes of War chit. So the lull in battle idea in general, I find a good idea. Again, it's this chaos, this suddenly everything just quietens down. That's fine. However, there's two things that you would expect in a lull that you can't get in the lull of the battle. One is, leading on from what I said before, reinforcement movement. So exactly what would prevent reinforcements moving up to the front because there was a lull in the battle? I don't kind of see where that comes from. The other thing is rallying. So with the lull in the battle, you can fire, but you can't move and can't do anything else. Just fire. And if you're out of command, you can't do anything. I think probably rallying should be there in the lull, because that would probably be the best time for rallying to happen, and ammunition restocking. It seems strange that after an hour of not much happening on the battlefield, the morale states of everybody is still the same. So I find that quite counterintuitive. And along with the reinforcement movement, that they stopped dead, definitely in that instance. So I would think I would have rallying in a lull in the battle, even though it is supposed to be like a degrade activation. But I'd probably make an exception for that for rallying. I think it would be a good time for rallying to happen. I think generally for reinforcements, I think something like, as long as they were staying on a road, the same road they came in on, or a contiguous road hex, a movement, then they should continue to be able to come on the board. Again, I don't find it counterintuitive that a bunch of units force march on the board, move in sort of however far it is, and then suddenly think, well, what do we do now? And then possibly sit there for several hours. I understand the sort of command confusion and things like that, but it just doesn't ring right. And maybe that kind of reinforcement movement stuff can be looked at, for my purposes anyway. The other thing, and I'm not sure if it's a dislike really, it's a terrain effect I'm not sure of, and that is the streams. It's not the fact that the streams are hard to get over. It's just that when you're on the hex with the stream, you get a combat shift against you. And what that means is that you kind of avoid them, so you skirt around them, or you don't cross them. And you fight either side of them. And they're actually, particularly with the regards of Flavigny, which is what you're looking at now in this hex here, they're actually all around it, and that's a victory point hex. And those three hexes here, I think particularly for the French, or certainly in this battle and how it works out, but maybe for the Prussians as well, makes the stream hexes not powerful, but very decisive in how they operate in the battle. So I'm not quite sure that that I like what the streams are. There's another area which is around Mars-la-Tour as well, that stream. And of course there's the stream that runs up here, up towards Rezonville, which with the Prussians you're either one side of or the other, which means it really shortens your frontage that you can deploy on. quite a bit. Might be useful for the Prussians, but even with the counter density the Prussians have, it still seemed, rather claustrophobic because of that stream hex. Because you wouldn't want to put anything on there because of the. I think it's a two column shift effect. A one column shift, one column shift effect, and I think column shifts are quite effective in this game, quite important. So you wouldn't want to be there. So I don't know. What I did have was I had sort of cavalry early on over here in these hexes with the 6th Cavalry Division here deployed there, so they could charge either side of the stream. But due to their column shifts for cavalry and the fact that you're going to add a stream in, it was like painting a target on the counters, really. And, please fire at me. So yeah, even then it was a case of, well, I can't even utilize it in that way. So yeah, streams, I don't know, they seem fairly restrictive. Taking the streams over onto the ravines, actually, one thing that did surprise me was that I understand that the LOS rules are fairly straightforward and really quite elegant, actually. Easy to understand, and you can just apply them, and it's very straight. You're not sort of holding bits of string and calculating whether one hex is closer to the target hex or the firing hex and all that kind of stuff. It's very nice, but the fact that you could be in a ravine and then several hexes away somebody could fire at you, I think the ravine seems to present a sort of extreme slope idea, yet line of sight wasn't affected. I'm not too sure about that. It might historically have been not a problem, but it seemed odd. It seemed odd to me. And finally, some observations and strategy. So, particularly with this battle, so there is a distinct funneling of the troops around the Vionville-Flavigny area. So we have the Bois de Tronville here, and we have the stream here. And between these 2 points, we have 4 hexes. And effectively, most of the battle happens in those 4 hexes until Mars-Latour starts to come online. Likewise, down here, between the 2 streams, there's a funneling effect again. So I think how far you are on this, on the line between these 2 features is very indicative of how well you're doing. Not literally because of the victory point hexes, but it's the ability to keep victory point hexes as well. And it was always in this game that the Prussians had effectively a sort of square arrangement here of either being in Vionville or being back here with these 2 artillery units as kind of sentries sitting there pouring fire in. And on the French, being stuck really here because they really couldn't get into this woods, and you were effectively down in this valley here. It was again difficult because you had upslopes to deal with, and anyway you were restricted to this hex because that's a woods. So that was a 1 hex move here, and a 1 hex move for an hour's turn means that you'd rather try and do something else with the French. So maybe not as restrictive for the Prussians as it was for the French, but with their lesser movement, their 3 movement points, and certainly once they're battle worn, their 2 movement points, there's really no way of flanking that position other than the big sweep round that we had up here with the 3rd Corps, which is a long way and takes quite a few turns to manage. So this is the critical area, these sort of 4 hexes really. And again up here these two hexes. My thoughts on the stream here meant that on this side of the ravine, if I pull back slightly, it was very difficult to get beyond the sort of 1 hex frontage between these two streams. This is a critical hex, and so is that. Once the French were established here with a hasty works marker early on, you were going to have to either involve the stream, in which case that opened you up to fire combat as the Prussians, or you did a frontal assault without the capability of doing any flanking manoeuvre or anything. And indeed, because of these narrow frontages, I didn't find there was a lot of capability to do flank combat. I don't think we had a single flank combat once in the game. So that tactic, that ability to column shift on flank movement, didn't really occur because of these narrow frontages. The Prussians didn't have enough infantry to be able to flank through the woods up here, I think, and the French didn't have the movement to do that. And then both sides had these bottlenecks here because of the streams, which seemed it was maybe me, and maybe I was being a little bit too cautious about them, but seemed fire magnets for me anyway. So you just elaborating a bit on the French. So really, with the French, you really need to stick to clear and road hexes. You don't want to get bogged down into any terrain, and slopes even are irritating and slows you down in a major way. The difference between the 3 and 4 movement points that I mentioned before, I think that the Prussians seemed a lot more zippy than an extra strength point seemed to give them, due to the terrain costs in the game. And I think that slowness is a big problem in the French army. I think maybe with the Gravelotte battle, which is a more set piece one, it doesn't become so much of a problem. But for the Mars La Tour scenario, it is really. I couldn't count the number of times I thought, right, I'm going to do something with this corps, and then actually when I looked at the movement, I thought, actually, they can't even get to where I want to do things with this turn, even though they're not that far away. And what would potentially be a big attack turned into rather a damp squib with a 1 hex frontage or something like that, because of that. So the slowness of the French is quite marked in the game. The other thing I'd say, particularly for the French, is that putting an infantry and a mitrailleuse unit in the same hex, you would also put an artillery unit in there, of course, because you have to, because it has to stack with the mitrailleuse unit. That kind of becomes your target. Again, painting a target on your head. There are not that many mitrailleuse units, and so when you do that, that's really a red flag to the Prussians and their artillery, and of course the artillery range of the Prussian cannon is much better than French, and actually really, really good. That you get that target painted on that hex, and the fire of the artillery can be quite devastating in that, as you've got 3 units with okay or decent morale, but never brilliant morale, with the exception of the Imperial Guard. But the Imperial Guard doesn't really have the strength points to do very much. If it really wanted to assault somewhere, it would have to be on a very narrow frontage to be able to generate the power. And because you can't stack 2 fresh infantry units together, that combat power would, it's difficult to generate with the Imperial Guard. So the stacking together is difficult, because very quickly we'll probably end up pretty decimated and out of action. So even though you could stack and you can combine the mitrailleuse and the infantry, it's probably not that great an idea to do it. because you just end up with a battle-worn mitrailleuse unit, and possibly an infantry unit, whereas every cannon shell going within a vicinity is going to dump onto that hex. So that particularly the strategy for the French on that. The final observation I probably have on the game, other than summing up, would be on the ranges. So, having done a little bit of analysis on it, the French optimal range from their enemy for fire combat is 2 hexes. So, the third hex, if you are 3 hexes away, your artillery, which is fairly weak, is still optimal, but your infantry and mitrailleurs aren't, and they're halved, and you get a significant drop off of your fire capability because of the weakness of your artillery. 2 hexes is the optimum. You're not 1 hex away, so you don't suffer from canister fire in return, or from Prussian infantry fire with their big units. They're halved at 2 hex range. So being at 2 hex range is probably the ideal that the French should be if they're not going to assault, if they're going to conduct their fire combat. Now, interestingly, with the Prussians, probably their optimal range is actually 4 hexes. So this precludes the infantry from firing, but unless you're adjacent, their firing isn't very good anyway. So it's all about the artillery, and the point at 4 hexes where the Prussian artillery, your artillery, is still full effectiveness, but everything on the French side is halved, including their artillery, means that you've got the point of 4 hexes where you've got a superiority, a fire superiority there, which is quite important. I think the Prussians can live at 2 hex range. I think 4 is great. Certainly early on in the game, there was, I think it was just around here, where the Prussian horse artillery was here firing into Vionville, and really nothing could touch him. The infantry didn't have the range, and the French artillery was fairly weak in reply, even though they were 3-factor Prussian artillery unit because of the shift they got anyway. So 4 hexes is I think optimal, and again, this sort of feeds into the army differentiation here in the game, that there is that difference. So yeah, I think that's enough of this COD strategy for myself after the single playthrough, but I hope people might find it important. Just on the summing up, I do like the game. I was surprised I liked the game, actually. I purchased it at the same time as a couple of other games, and I kind of put it to one side and thought, yeah, I'll get to it. It's a battle game. It's a Victorian, possibly Napoleonic type game. What's new under the sun kind of idea. I was more interested in the subject matter than possibly the game itself. I hadn't had a Franco-Prussian War game before, but I was pleasantly surprised once I took it off the shelf and actually looked at it and started reading the rules. I thought, well, hold on, there's something here. But even then, you didn't quite get the effect of the game until you actually push counters around, as they say, and started firing. Firing units and all that kind of stuff, and pulling chits. In that it kind of has a certain life of its own, which again I haven't seen very much. So I do really quite like the game, and I will definitely play it again. It's not one that's going to gather dust. I might try the Gravelot scenario soon. I know it's a bit more of a set piece, and maybe this Celtic fluidity is not quite as marked as it is in the Mars Latour. But I'm only guessing there. I don't really know. So anyway, it's highly recommended. I think it's not the most expensive of games, and it does give you a lot of variety. There's a lot of scenarios, and I'd say that the game system is very good. Bar my dislikes, which are kind of peripheral, really, from the main gameplay, but still, it's a great game, and I do recommend it. And anyway, well, thanks for watching. If you've watched the entire playthrough, well done. Pat yourself on the back. Have a drink on me, because it's quite a slog to go through, I'm sure, on video. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to do quite a few more of these, of various games, and hopefully I'll improve. I'll get maybe tone down the car noises and the horse noises when they interject, and maybe get a bit better at my camera work as well, when the focus goes off, or the camera just doesn't run for a little bit. So I'm still learning here, on etiquette and procedure, but I've enjoyed doing it. And anyway, I'll hopefully see you on the next one. Bye for now.